It began as a strange shimmer on the horizon, a pale green haze drifting low over the shattered fields of Ypres. At first, the French soldiers thought it was smoke from the shelling, another trick of the battlefield's chaos. But then came the smell, sharp, metallic, and alien, a scent that burned the back of the throat before the mind could name it. The wind carried death that evening. Chlorine gas, heavier than air, slid silently across no man's land, curling into trenches where men huddled unaware. They watched it move, fascinated and afraid, until their lungs seized and the fascination turned to horror. Voices broke into screams. Rifles clattered as men clawed at their throats, gasping for air that no longer fed them. Their eyes streamed tears that scalded. Their skin blistered as the mist enveloped everything. Horses thrashed, birds fell silent, and the line disintegrated into a chaos of coughing silhouettes stumbling through the poison. No shells exploded, no bullets fired. This was a new kind of assault, invisible, inescapable, and absolute. The battlefield itself had turned against them. By nightfall, 4 miles of the Allied front had been erased, not by artillery, but by chemistry. Those who survived would never forget the color of the air that day, nor the sound of men drowning on dry land. The age of gas had begun. In the hours that followed, the trenches dissolved into instinct. Officers shouted commands no one could hear over the choking. Men tore off their tunics, soaked them in puddles, in urine, in mud, anything to stop the burning. The battlefield reeked of desperation. Some buried their faces in damp earth. Others tried to outrun the mist, only to collapse in ditches where the gas lay thicker. There was no training, no handbook for this. The human body, the strongest machine of war, was unarmed against the elements themselves. Messages arrived at headquarters incoherent and panicked. Green fog. Men falling. Can't breathe. The generals, at first, dismissed it as confusion, an exaggeration. But when the wounded stumbled back with faces blistered and eyes like glass, the truth was undeniable. Something unthinkable had been unleashed. Among the survivors, an odd silence took hold, the kind that only follows witnessing the impossible. The first improvised defenses were born from that silence. Soldiers learned to soak rags, to breathe through wet fabric. It wasn't protection, just a pause between agony and death, but it was enough to plant the first seed of adaptation. For the first time, war had crossed a line. It was no longer about courage or steel or trenches, it was about science and fear and air itself. The survivors of Ypres would later say the gas made no sound, yet it screamed louder than any shell. It was the birth of a weapon that turned breath into an enemy and humanity into its own test subject. After Ypres, war changed overnight. The enemy was no longer a figure in a uniform, it was the air itself. Armies across Europe scrambled to fight what they couldn't see. Laboratories became as vital as trenches, and chemists replaced cavalrymen as the vanguard of survival. In Paris, London, and Berlin, scientists and soldiers worked side by side, sketching frantic designs on chalkboards stained with formulas. Cloth soaked in sodium thiosulfate, goggles sealed with wax, filters of charcoal and layers of gauze, anything that could keep poison from the lungs. It was no longer about attacking, it was about breathing. The British first issued cotton pads drenched in neutralizing chemicals, crude, stifling, and unreliable. The French tried mouthpieces and goggles tied together with cords, each iteration a balance between fear and invention. Even the Germans, the originators of gas warfare, scrambled to protect their own troops from the same clouds they had released. Every nation was learning the same grim truth. Innovation born in desperation often saved lives only by inches. Soldiers became test subjects, marching with experimental masks that steamed up, leaked, or fell apart under pressure. Yet with each failure came progress. By the end of 1915, the race to breathe had transformed from chaos to science. For the first time since the green mist rolled across Ypres, there was a flicker of control, fragile, improvised, but real. Humanity had begun to answer its own creation. In the heart of France's wartime laboratories, engineers and physicians labored over a new design. The result was simple yet ingenious: the M2 mask. 2 layers of chemically treated gauze covered the mouth and nose, secured by elastic straps. A small celluloid window protected the eyes, and a nose clip reduced air leakage. It wasn't elegant, but it worked. The M2 was the first gas mask designed for the common soldier, not a scientist's prototype, but a tool of survival mass-produced by the thousands. It was the fragile bridge between death and endurance. Training began in muddy fields behind the front. Men practiced donning their masks in seconds, their fingers trembling as officers timed them with stopwatches. The first breaths inside the mask were claustrophobic, hot, damp, and suffocating. Some panicked and tore them off. Others forced themselves to trust the strange contraption, even as the smell of chemicals stung their nostrils. Officers watched with cautious optimism. Here, at last, was something that could give soldiers a fighting chance. But the doubts lingered. Could a few layers of fabric really stop death? On misty mornings, gas alarms echoed across the lines. Sirens wailed, and men reached instinctively for their masks, no longer helpless, but still afraid. The battlefield became a theater of strange figures with blank, glassy faces, voices muffled behind damp filters. The M2 mask was humanity's first real reply to industrial terror, a blend of chemistry and courage. Yet beneath its promise lay an uneasy truth. Each invention in this new science of survival only prepared the world for more refined forms of horror yet to come. By the winter of 1915, chlorine gas was no longer the most feared weapon on the front. Its sickly green clouds announced themselves too boldly, giving the enemy time to flee or brace. The next step in chemical warfare would be invisible, nearly scentless death that arrived without warning. Phosgene was born in laboratories that had once produced dyes and disinfectants. Its formula was deceptively simple, its effect devastating. Unlike chlorine, it didn't burn the lungs immediately. Soldiers could breathe it in, feel only mild irritation, and believe themselves safe. Hours later, their lungs would fill silently with fluid, drowning them from within. It was a killer crafted for subtlety, the perfect evolution in a war that was learning to hide its cruelties behind science. The Germans first released phosgene near Ypres again, this time mixed with chlorine to disguise its presence. Entire trenches fell still, victims of something that looked like ordinary fog. The Allies soon followed, producing their own variations. Factories that once made perfume and paint now brewed weapons of suffocation. Scientists debated formulas while soldiers gasped through masks not yet proofed against the new gas. With phosgene, the battlefield lost even the mercy of warning. Death was no longer loud or dramatic. It came on the breeze, in a whisper of mist, and often too late to escape. The age of industrial murder had entered its second phase, quieter, smarter, and far more cruel. Every sunrise brought a new ritual. Men woke, scanned the horizon, and studied the wind. A faint shift in direction could mean life or death. They learned to read the sky like farmers once did for rain, for warmth, for poison. Gas sentries stood along the parapets, masks slung at their chests, watching for a shimmer, a ripple in the morning haze. Even a glint of sunlight through damp air could spark panic. The trenches were filled with whispers: is that fog or gas? At night, soldiers slept lightly, their masks within arm's reach. Dreams of suffocation haunted them more than bullets. The enemy was no longer across the field, it lived in every breath. Letters home rarely mentioned gas. The soldiers struggled to explain it. How could one describe fighting the air itself? Some spoke of the taste of metal, of sudden coughing fits that ended in silence. Others wrote of comrades frozen in terror, masks half-tied, eyes wide with realization. Commanders issued new drills. Check your mask. Test the seal. Watch the wind. The monotony of survival became a new form of exhaustion. For every advance in weaponry, there was an equal demand on the human mind to endure it. The front lines had become laboratories of fear. Science dictated survival, and instinct was no longer enough. Yet amid the quiet dread, men still stood their posts. clinging to the strange hope that knowledge, the very thing that had unleashed this horror, might also one day save them. The Great War had found a new dimension, an invisible front, where courage meant daring to breathe. By 1916, fear had become procedure. Every regiment on the Western Front began its mornings not with rifle inspection, but with the ritual of the gas mask drill. In the frozen mud, whistles shrieked and men scrambled to secure their masks in under 6 seconds. Any slower, and the air itself could betray them. Officers shouted, "Masks on! Breathe steady!" as the troops fumbled with rubberized fabric and fogging lenses. Some laughed nervously, turning the exercise into grim humor. Others felt the silent weight of what these seconds might one day mean. Each drill turned chaos into choreography. Fingers learned to find straps in the dark. Men practiced sleeping with masks half-fastened, ready for alarms in the night. The clumsy prototype stiff canvas with eyepieces that leaked and filters that clogged became extensions of their faces, as vital as their rifles. Gradually, fear began to take shape as discipline. The soldiers no longer froze at the sound of the gas gong. They moved instinctively, efficiently. Survival became muscle memory. The front was no longer paralyzed by dread, it was adapting. Science had armed both sides, but now it was teaching the living how to fight back. Beneath the reek of chemicals and damp wool, courage was reforming not as reckless bravery, but as practiced control. In mastering the ritual of the mask, the men reclaimed a fragment of power in a war that had stripped so much away. It was near Verdun when the test came. The warning gongs clanged in the mist, and the familiar cry echoed down the trench. "Gas! Gas incoming!" Within seconds, hundreds of French soldiers snapped into motion. Masks sealed, filters humming faintly, they crouched as a pale yellow fog crept across the no man's land. Where once there would have been chaos, men clawing for air, stumbling blind, there was now grim order. They held their rifles tight, breathing slow and shallow, eyes fixed on the unseen. The gas rolled in heavy waves, sinking into shell craters and creeping over parapets. But the line did not break. Through the thick haze, muffled commands cut the air. "Hold fast. Keep firing." Machine guns rattled, bullets slicing through the cloud toward advancing German infantry who expected panic and found defiance instead. Inside their masks, the soldiers could hear only their own breath, a rhythm of survival that matched the heartbeats around them. Visibility was near zero, but discipline carried them through. Hours passed. The fog thinned. The men emerged blackened, coughing and trembling but alive. Word spread along the front of the masked French who had held their ground. For the first time, the gas had failed to break the human line. That day, the meaning of courage shifted. It was no longer the roar of charge or the gleam of heroism in open combat. It was the quiet endurance of men who dared to breathe poison and still refused to run. Under the cloud, they had faced the invisible and endured. By late 1916, the air on the Western Front no longer belonged to the enemy. The green haze that had once sent whole divisions fleeing now drifted across the battlefield like a grim reminder, not an omen. The French, hardened and masked, had learned to move through it. On the dawn of their first major counterattack under lingering gas, the soldiers waited behind their lines near Verdun. Visibility was low, the landscape a pale, shifting blur. The order came quietly: advance. They rose, figures in ghostly canvas masks, lenses glinting through the mist. The enemy had counted on paralysis, on the primal terror that once came with that acrid smell. Instead, the French infantry surged forward in steady rhythm, bayonets fixed, artillery pounding ahead of them. The gas clung to the ground, but their filters held. It was no longer a nightmare, it was terrain, one more obstacle to be conquered. Machine guns opened from the German trenches, but the attackers pressed on, unfazed, methodical. Behind them, the guns shifted fire with mathematical precision, clearing their path yard by yard. By nightfall, the tricolor once again fluttered above positions long lost to poison. The soldiers, exhausted and coughing, didn't cheer. They simply stood in silence, their faces hidden, their victory quiet. This was no glorious charge of old, it was the triumph of endurance, intellect, and will. Humanity had stared into the abyss, studied it, and walked through its vapors to strike back. The French command, once reactive, now thought like scientists. Fear had become data. They began to treat gas not as a terror, but as an equation: wind speed, direction, temperature, and humidity, all measured before a single shell was fired. Meteorological units were deployed alongside artillery. Officers trained to read the air like maps, calculating how long gas would linger, where it would drift, and when it would dissipate just enough for masked infantry to move. What had once been chaos was now choreography. The counteroffensive near Verdun became the model. Gas screens could obscure troop movements, while coordinated barrages drove defenders from cover. When combined with tanks and machine guns, gas, once a weapon of fear, became part of a larger, terrible precision. Soldiers adapted too. They learned to read the battlefield by smell, by silence, by the texture of the air. Every motion was calculated, every breath measured. The enemy's advantage had turned into a shared language of survival and calculation. Even the Germans, once masters of chemical terror, recognized the shift. Reports describe the cold resolve of French units fighting in gas zones, their movements clockwork, their nerves unbroken. Science had equalized horror. The front had transformed into a vast laboratory where courage and calculation met. In this strange balance between intellect and instinct, man and machine, poison and mask, the war revealed something deeper. The capacity of human beings to learn from fear itself. The gas that once symbolized inhumanity now marked the moment humanity adapted, endured, and, against all odds, reclaimed the initiative. When the guns fell silent between bombardments, another kind of silence haunted the laboratories. The chemists who had created the gases, brilliant minds drawn from universities in Berlin, Paris, and London, found themselves wrestling with an unbearable paradox. They had advanced science, yet deepened suffering. Fritz Haber, the German pioneer of chlorine gas, once spoke of chemistry as the weapon of intellect, a force that could shorten wars by shocking enemies into surrender. But as the dead piled up and nations retaliated with their own mixtures, the illusion of scientific neutrality began to dissolve. Many of his peers recoiled at what they had wrought. Some refused further military work, their pride turning to shame. Others, convinced of patriotic duty, rationalized the horror as progress, as an inevitable evolution of modern warfare. Across borders, the moral questions were the same. Was discovery itself guilty if used inhumanely? Could a chemist be both scholar and soldier? Letters between Allied scientists echoed with regret, their technical language thinly veiling grief. After Ypres, after Verdun, there was no going back. Chemistry had changed war, and with it, the soul of science. The discipline that once symbolized healing, industry, and enlightenment now carried the odor of the trenches. In the quiet after each battle, as reports tallied thousands of gas casualties, those who mixed the formulas were left to confront the invisible residue of their own creation. The fog lingered not just over the fields, but over the conscience of an age. The words that survive from the front speak with an aching simplicity that science could never match. Letters, diaries, and fragments scrawled in trembling hands tell the story from beneath the mask where fear, love, and duty coexisted in the same breath. A French infantryman wrote, "We breathe through cloth now. Every sound comes from inside the skull, the world is smaller." His handwriting trails off where the paper is stained with moisture, perhaps condensation from his mask. A British medic described tending to gassed men, eyes clouded, voices whispering. They are calm because they cannot panic, there isn't enough air. Another, from a German soldier near Verdun, confided, "We send the wind forward now. I dream that it turns and comes back." Each account blurs nationality, the suffering is universal. The gas did not care who inhaled it. It stripped men of identity, leaving only the shared, fragile rhythm of survival. For medics and stretcher-bearers, the aftermath was a recurring nightmare: lungs seared, comrades unrecognizable. The smell of bleach and death mingled with mud. They washed, treated, and carried those who could still gasp, knowing the next cloud might be theirs. In these small human testimonies lies the war's truest document, not the statistics of shells fired or miles gained, but the private words of those who saw the fog descend and lived to tell of it. Their voices, thin as the air they once breathed, echo through history not as condemnation alone, but as remembrance, proof that in every advance of science or strategy, the cost is written first in the lungs of the living. When the guns of 1918 finally fell silent, the world exhaled, but the air still held the memory of poison. The nations that emerged from the Great War carried more than ruins and grief. They carried an understanding that certain weapons went beyond the boundaries of civilization. In 1925, the Geneva Protocol marked the first great collective attempt to forbid the use of chemical and biological arms. Though imperfect, leaving loopholes for storage and retaliation, it stood as a moral milestone. For the first time, humanity acknowledged that scientific brilliance must bow to conscience. Veterans, medics, and humanitarian advocates became unexpected architects of this movement. Their testimonies, their damaged lungs, and their unwavering insistence on remembrance pushed governments to act. The Red Cross, newly empowered, began campaigning not just for treatment of the wounded, but for the protection of all combatants from invisible suffering. Even the scientists who once served military labs joined in the reform. They founded institutes for peaceful research, agriculture, medicine, and industry, reclaiming chemistry from war. The same elements that once choked soldiers in Flanders now nourished crops and healed wounds. For a time, the air grew cleaner, both literally and morally. The world had seen what it meant to weaponize breath itself, and vowed never to repeat it. The promise was fragile, like the thin membrane of a gas mask, but it was something. A generation scarred by the fog had chosen, at last, to protect the right to breathe. The story of gas warfare ends not with the silence of the dead, but with the quiet persistence of the living. Out of every choking trench, every desperate breath behind a mask, emerged something indestructible: the instinct to endure. Those who survived the clouds did not speak of heroism, they spoke of holding on, of waiting for the wind to shift, of helping a fallen comrade remove a mask just long enough to drink. These small, ordinary gestures, simple acts of care amid the unspeakable, became the true legacy of the gas age. In memorials across Europe, statues of soldiers no longer stand tall with rifles raised. Instead, they kneel, masked or unmasked, eyes lifted to the open sky. The symbolism endures: humanity, bruised but breathing, reclaiming the air that war once tried to steal. Modern chemical treaties, emergency response systems, and international bans all trace their lineage back to the trenches of Ypres. Every filter, every laboratory warning label is a whisper from that era, a reminder of what it cost to learn compassion through suffering. And yet, the ultimate legacy is not technological. It is human. It lies in our refusal to accept that progress must come through pain. It lives in the idea that even when the air itself turns against us, we will find a way to breathe again. The men who once faced the green mist could not have imagined peace returning to those same fields. But today, grass grows where gas once lingered, silent, clean, alive. The breath of humanity continues.